Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode, today and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Nate Joens about his work at Structurally to build conversational AI utilities that augment human sales interactions. So, Nate, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Nate Joens here, co-founder and head of innovation at Structurally.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, it was through Structurally. Our team, our backend, our machine learning to what we call our data layer is all built in Python. And my first exposure to it was in college through kind of GIS, Geographic Information System means. So kind of mapping on steroids, really kind of fell in love with it there. And then we took our engineering team a little bit further than that with machine learning and enterprise level application, basically with Structurally.
And so can you describe a bit about what it is that you're building at Structurally and some of the story behind how it got started and some of the ways that you're using conversational AI and just general machine learning in the business?
Really got our start out of college, spent our time talking to a lot of salespeople, basically figuring out what their problem was. And it was very common that salespeople hate following up and like qualifying leads. They love it when they're at the closing table and can, get really close to the commission, but they hate the behind the scenes work of chasing leads. And that's really where the money's made. So we set out to solve that problem with conversational AI. Over text and email, our product works to basically follow up with leads from different sources in all sorts of different industries, have back and forth two-way conversations that essentially qualify or disqualify them, and then pass them back off to a sales rep to ideally close.
Digging more into the conversational AI aspect and some of the ways that you're applying it to these sales conversations, I'm wondering if you can just talk through what you actually mean by the term conversational AI and how it compares to the sort of wave of chatbots that became popular maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that question because we typically have steered away from the word chatbot because it does have some baggage, I would say, from the last few years. I would say that a chatbot is very simply, basically an application that lives in a messaging UI at a very simple level. So it does very basic things, pretty straightforward, and it's usually very evident 100% of the time that it is in fact like a bot. You usually interact with it by like clicking buttons or like quick replies, super simple, very rudimentary, usually based on predefined kind of decision trees. I would classify conversational AI in a different way in that it's a lot more human-like. It's a lot more random. It feels like you're talking to a human. You can say one thing, go completely off script per se, come back to that, go somewhere else, and the AI can keep up with that while still directing the conversation forward in a business-like or like the application-like way. So the conversational AI still usually has a purpose. It's usually not there to just hold a conversation for fun. It's usually there for some purpose, in our case, to qualify leads, in other cases to, maybe tease out a purchase of an e-commerce product or something like that. But ultimately, it feels like you're actually talking to a human. And I think that is the really big difference in our product in conversational AI versus kind of the early wave of chatbots.
As you mentioned with chatbots, it's generally very evident that you are interacting with this sort of mechanistic automated system. And so you're not going to try to treat it as you would a regular human. You're not going to try and have sort of free-flowing conversations with it. And I'm wondering what the useful interaction patterns are for people who are engaging with these conversational AIs where there is more flexibility in the ways that it can respond and the ways that it can understand the cues and contexts of the conversation. Is it something where you're still going to be very sort of forthcoming about the fact that it is a mechanistic agent that you're interacting with? Or is it something where you would potentially want to have it masquerade as the eventual person that you're actually going to be communicating with in person?
Yeah, that's a good question. We kind of split the difference and we say this is an assistant for whoever we work on behalf of. We're pretty careful and vague on purpose a little bit about the fact that it's an assistant, but we're not trying to confuse people or, mislead them. It is still technically an assistant. And across all of the many millions of conversations that we've had, or the AI has had, we've seen that 99.9% actually believe they're talking to a human. There's 0.1% that we've identified through a number of our intents that we can look at to say these people are asking questions, trying to figure out if it's a human or realize that it is actually a robot, a computer. And so we're really proud of that. And that wasn't just by accident. Like, we do a lot of things in the conversation to make it feel superhuman. Like, so when someone says, in real estate, like where we have a lot of customers or mortgage or leasing or insurance, a lot of people are saying things like, I'm going through a divorce. I just had a death. I've got a sickness in the family. Something like that. We pick up on all of those, pretty like human empathetic, points in a conversation and say like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Or congrats on the new job. Or thank you for your service if you're a veteran. Things like that go a long way in the conversations, as well as little things like putting purposeful typos in our messages that we actually then correct immediately after with like a little asterisk. So like those are the little things that make it feel like a real assistant. And that's what we set out to do from the beginning.
In the process of designing the interaction patterns and the capabilities that you wanted to build into the system, what were some of the lessons that you were able to take from these previous generation sort of chatbot-oriented workflows, both in positive and negative signals?
I would say in a very simple way, decision trees don't scale or work in any form. We've all seen them in typical chatbot builders. If someone says this, you can go down here. Someone says this, you can go down here. But we set out to have a lot more flexibility in the way that our conversational engine works, but while still giving our customers the ability to customize their conversations. Since that's super important, there's a huge new wave today of like generative AI, where you can build a chatbot with all sorts of pre-trained data or a little bit of your own, and it just spits out what it thinks is best from the open internet, basically. That doesn't necessarily work when you have business use cases, when businesses need to say very specific things in very certain situations. So like one example is we support use cases for SaaS companies, and they get customers saying, hey, what's your pricing? Well, every SaaS company has different pricing, so we can't just spit out some random nonsense. We have to allow them to customize that response. So we set out with a very robust script customization framework that allows for more what I would consider like random navigation through a conversation. So rather than, if you make it down this part of the tree, you can't switch over to here, or you can't go here, you can't go here. That's how a conversation works. You typically are kind of going all over a tree, not just down one path. And most typical chatbots say, hey, once you're down this path, you can either like restart or just end. We say, hey, you can actually go over here. You can skip a few questions. You can come back here. We'll keep it all in order. And we will allow our users to also leverage that knowledge to customize conversations as well.
To the point of being able to keep track of what elements of the conversation you've already visited, what are the other aspects that you want to be able to touch upon, and how do you naturally go from, the third path on branch B back to, the second branch on path A, and then be able to sort of maintain appropriate state information of the conversation? Like, what are some of the complexities or challenges or sort of backing capabilities that you've had to design?
That's a very good question, because the state management is an overlooked kind of aspect. In typical applications, you can kind of manage it like an app, but in conversational state management, you got to keep a lot in order. We have kind of like 3 or 4 main concepts that we use in our conversational framework. They're pretty common to most chatbots or conversational AI. They're slots, intents, contexts, and we call the other one another form of intents, but they're kind of called custom answers or just answers. So slots are essentially the data that we're keeping track of. We have over 200 or 300. So that could be anything from like someone telling us the location they're looking for a house in, or the number of employees that work at their company. Any piece of information that might be relevant for our AI to extract in a conversation, which it does automatically, and store, that's a slot. An intent is something that a lead or a contact will say. So it might say, hey, what's your pricing? Or can you tell me about your pricing? That would be the, ask about pricing intent. Context is when we ask a question. So if we say something like, hey, can you tell me how many employees work at your company? If the lead just replies randomly with, 500, well, what does 500 mean? Out of context, we have no idea. But in context, we know that we just asked the employee question. So employees equals 500. And that's where we fill the slots. So all of that data is used not only in our conversational framework to customize all of our conversations, but also in the way that we train our models. We use context, slots, and intents all to train our models constantly. And we have a team of human AI trainers who are constantly reviewing our conversations, millions of conversations, and tagging each of our leads' messages with forms of context, slots, and intents.
As you mentioned, you're focused primarily on these business and sales use cases. And so there's a lot of contextual information about what direction you might want to go down for a particular conversation. So if somebody is in the sort of exploratory phase of deciding, do they want to purchase a house? What is on the market? They might be asking about the price ranges for certain neighborhoods or certain attributes of a neighborhood, like what the school ratings might be or any particular, the distance to the closest grocery store, things like that. And I'm wondering, as you're designing this conversational framework and deciding points of customization that you want to expose to your customers, how much domain expertise do you need to bring into the overall concept of either the specific industry that the salesperson is participating in or the overall sort of strategies of sales techniques, and just how much of that is necessary to be able to make that framework effective and flexible enough for the end user?
I would say, to kind of set the stage here, we think about customization in three ways. One is the actual script customization, so the back and forth once a lead actually replies. Two is like the follow-up cadence for unresponsive leads. So we do both of those. That's pretty basic of most CRMs. And then three is what I mentioned earlier about like answers. You can almost think of those as like a conversational FAQs, where there's a huge list of, we have about, again, 200 or so of these intents, anything from, like you were expressing earlier, how's the market? Or tell me about your pricing, or other ones like mention divorce, like I mentioned earlier. All of those can be customized too, kind of in a conversational FAQ way. So we have predefined versions of those follow-up campaigns, scripts, and answers for each industry. So real estate, mortgage, software, insurance. We have defined pre-built use cases you can kind of think of, or playbooks for all of those different verticals. And if our customers want to, they can use those out of the box. If they don't, and they want to like add certain things like how to answer the pricing question, or they want to tweak how they handle someone saying that they're already working with a competitor or something like that, they can do that by essentially copying our duplicates and tweaking. So there's not a lot of, domain expertise that we particularly need outside of setting up those initial kind of default playbooks across those different kind of customization tools.
Another interesting element of this problem space is, going back to the example of somebody who's trying to understand the real estate market for a particular neighborhood. There's a lot of information that needs to be present in the system to be able to reference it effectively, so that if somebody says, what is the price range for houses in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is, as we all know, astronomical, you have to have an integration with the MLS listings to be able to understand, okay, they're looking in the market district. So that means that these are the houses that are available. Now I need to be able to compute the, mean or median of that range so that I can respond with that answer. Or if they're asking about the school ratings, I now need to say, okay, what are the schools within this geographical boundary? Now I need to pull that rating information from this other source, and just wondering what your process is for being able to build out those sort of integrations of informational assets that are necessary to make that conversation effective and useful.
Yeah, so right now we are kind of taking a little bit more passive stance to that, is what we found. So we started out, kind of in some markets integrating really hardcore with those different data sources like MLS data. But we found that upfront answering a lot of our leads questions with answers. So like if someone says, hey, looking at 123 Main Street, how many beds does it have? We would actually answer that with a real answer. And what we found was people would actually like stop talking after that, which was really weird because we gave them what they want. But what we found after kind of exploring different markets was usually people, if they hear an answer they don't like, they just give up. So if they were looking for a 4-bedroom and we said 123 Main Street has a 3, they're gone. So we took a little bit more of a passive approach to answering really specific questions like that. And instead we say things like, through those default kind of scripts that I mentioned earlier, let me have a team member look up the number of beds and get back to you. By the way, can you tell me how many bathrooms you're looking for? That keeps it going. That keeps them on the hook. And then we can pass it off to an agent to give them that answer. But that said, through that entire script customization kind of framework, like I said, there's opportunities to bring in custom answers. So, for example, the pricing one is a really good example again, where if someone says, hey, looking at your entry plan, how many leads does that have? That can be an answer that we can then plug into our system through script customization on behalf of individual users to answer that kind of on a one-by-one basis.
And so digging more into the platform level capabilities of what you're building, I'm wondering if you can talk through some of the ways that you have designed and architected the sort of machine learning processes, your training mechanisms, how you're thinking about the conversational design elements, and some of the sort of technical challenges and engineering challenges that you've had to deal with as you've been building out the company.
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned some of like how we train the data to start using slots, contexts, and intents. So that was like step number 1, was identifying a framework that we can actually use to tag data and train data. And that was where we started. We've kind of evolved over time to really treat this like a translation problem, where we get a piece of text from a lead, whether it's over text message or email or live chat, and we want to translate that raw English, Spanish, whatever language into a computer readable, essentially, format of an intent and slot value that our product understands. So, for example, if a lead says something like, I would like to buy a home in San Francisco with 2 beds. That's the English. We're translating that to buying home, beds equals 2. And that's the translation problem. So we actually have really honed in on treating this like a neural machine translation problem. And that's kind of how we've always thought about the model itself. And that's the model that we're at least still using today. There's a lot that goes into that, but it really starts with tagging data appropriately using intents and slots, like I mentioned.
Obviously, the core model that you're building is this sort of conversational capability, which has elements of natural language processing and natural language understanding. I'm wondering, what are some of the other ways that you're applying ML either to help with the sort of operational and engineering aspects, or sort of additional contextual models that might work in tandem with the sort of core infrastructure?
Yeah, that's probably my favorite question you've asked because it's something that's been on our mind a lot lately. I kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about like what domain expertise do we need to get into new markets or new industries, or how does that all work? And we always start by defining like pre-built scripts and drips or follow-up cadences and answers. So there's a lot of content there. If you can imagine every playbook that a sales and marketing team has, they have to distill it into a script and think through every aspect of a conversation. So if we ask this question, a lead says this, then this needs to happen. If they ask pricing, I need to answer it this way. If they tell us their usage or number of employees, I need to answer this way. The number of things that our customers can customize is essentially infinite. They can string together tons of different scripts for all different use cases, for all different answers. And that's great, but it's also overwhelming. And we have taken some of the burden off of our customers to get started in using the product, pre-built kind of default playbooks that we offer. But obviously that doesn't fit everyone's perfect use case or business. And there needs to be some aspect of customization up front. So one area that we're really interested in right now is actually using generative AI to write our scripts for us, basically. And that's not necessarily a problem that like we're in love with solving from the ground up. We built our entire conversational model from the ground up for our distinct use case. But there are other products that are really good at generative AI, like the whole wave of GPT-3 that we've been exploring for our use case, because we have tons of data to say, you know, in this context, in this qualifier with these slots, this question should be asked. So we're looking at ways that we can actually kind of bootstrap our scripts using GPT-3 to generate the follow-up cadences and the actual two-way back and forth so our customers don't have to.
And to your point of cadence and your earlier mention of intentionally adding in typos and corrections, I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that you are using the sort of analytical aspects of looking at the conversations that are taking place and determining sort of the effectiveness, whether that's the length of the conversation or number of back and forth elements to it, and understanding, you know, this is the optimal delay for timing, or, you know, do I need to randomize the delay to make it seem more human-like? And, you know, how frequently do I want to introduce these typographical errors or other, you know, human-seeming foibles?
That's a huge area that is pretty untapped for us right now. Like, we're obviously looking at some basic stuff. We track all of that. One of my favorite data visualization models that we don't do a lot of, but have thought about building in a more productized way, is actually using like a Sankey diagram, where every lead starts at, you know, 100% on this side, and some funnel into this part, some funnel into that part, and then so on and so forth. So there's actually some great chatbot analytics tools out there. Chatbase is one that's actually offered by Google that I think got moved into Dialogflow or something like that recently, that actually offers a Sankey diagram just like that. And I think that's been the most useful, because some people in conversation will say every answer up front. They'll say, I'm looking for a 2-bed, 2-bath, under 500K. I'm pre-approved, not working with an agent, want to move in the next 5 months. One message. Others will drag it out over 10 messages. And it's not that one is better or worse. We have to account for all situations in between. So we don't necessarily like to look at like length of conversation, although it is a good leading indicator to have a successful conversation, because if someone stayed on the hook that long, it's pretty obvious that they're interested and feel like they're talking to a human. But we're a lot more deliberate in caring about what is actually said in a conversation. And we actually can track every intent that was executed and slot that was filled in a conversation in kind of a time-based approach, to say this was said after this was said after this slot was filled after this. And that's something that we look at pretty closely, but haven't been able to build, you know, a huge, robust kind of mind map of our millions of conversations. Although we're moving more towards a data warehouse approach to allow us to do that, because we have tons of data stored on a conversational, very granular level from these conversations over millions of messages.
In terms of the actual engineering aspects, I'm wondering if you can talk through some of the model design, if you're using more sort of traditional statistical approaches, if you're doing deep learning, sort of what your decision process was for identifying which frameworks were most effective or most useful for you, given the objectives that you have or the experience of your team, and just some of the sort of ecosystem aspects of being able to build out a business like this and relying so heavily on Python.
I'll speak briefly to it, but would love to let the actual AI engineer talk about the math. So one thing that we could possibly link to is our AI engineer wrote a blog about his approach to our sequence-to-sequence models with a dash of reinforcement learning. So it's a Medium article. It goes through all of the math that goes into our model and the different approaches. But at a high level, we ultimately landed on using PyTorch in the early days. We've been moving around a little bit lately as we're developing a new model from kind of scratch today, where our machine learning engineer is actually a contributor to Allen Institute of Artificial Intelligence as well. So we use some of their tools. And I think we're now moving towards more of a GPT-2 model that we've built in-house. So there's kind of a lot going on. I would say that article, as well as just checking out some of his other articles, would be a great in-depth look at the math and the stats behind some of these different approaches.
In terms of the sort of complexities of being able to operationalize these models, I know that there are a lot of challenges that come into play when models hit the real world, and you have to deal with things like concept drift and accuracy and performance, where performance might be mapped along multiple different axes of, time to generate an inference or performance in terms of the accuracy of the inference that's generated. And I'm wondering, what are some of the sort of engineering and operational challenges that you and your team have been dealing with?
Yeah, so I would say the model pipeline itself was a challenge early on. When we started the company, everything from pre-processing to post-processing was happening in a single model, a single application, basically. And then we said, no, okay, let's break each out into different applications, different endpoints, essentially. And then we actually went back to just having everything predicted through one model. We decided that was best. So I think that was a long process to figure out what worked best there. But ultimately, one of the things that we're most interested in, again, from like an operational proactive approach, is I talked about we have a kind of a human in the loop team that's monitoring conversations when they kind of go south to bring them back, but also doing that, they're training data constantly, both like after conversations and during conversations. So we get a really good live look at how our model is performing in production down to the second. Right now it's happening. And we're constantly looking at the F score or the F1 score to say, okay, how different was what was predicted versus what was approved or annotated? And I think that's, boiled down at a really high level, even from, senior leadership team. We love to look at that number to say, is our model improving in this way? Because our human team shouldn't be labeling the same types of messages over and over and over. We should get better at those ones we've seen and rely on the human team to really focus on the ones that we've never seen before and ultimately drive that down with broader data. So we really like to look at that score kind of in real time and constantly for improvements.
In terms of the training data, you mentioned that you want to cut down on the amount of human intervention necessary to do the labeling. I'm wondering if you can just talk through some of the ways that you're able to source that training data, particularly as you're moving into new markets, and what level of effort you've put into looking at things like Snorkel AI or sort of automated data labeling to be able to scale the process of being able to actually generate enough training data.
So I would say that we like to own our training data in-house because it's so nuanced and so robust. Any individual message can have upwards of, well, technically infinite or, close to number of combinations of slots and intents and contexts on them to be labeled. So we've invested a ton into training our human AI trainers to make sure that the data is labeled very accurately. But one of the really interesting pieces you asked there was, how can we leverage that to get into new, use cases? That's a really good question, because if you think about it, we're restricted to our AI essentially knowing only about the slots and contexts that we've told it to. We have like 300 and it's constantly growing. But every time we add one, essentially it's new. So we might add a new qualifier that's favorite color, never used before. But how will we know that a lead saying purple or yellow is actually their favorite color? Things like that. One of the ways that we've actually kind of overcome that is by leveraging scripting in a way that uses other data from other industries. So if you think about it, like, automotive, for example, is not that different conversationally from like real estate or mortgage. We're asking things like, are you already working with a salesperson? Or what's your time frame? What's your price range? So we have tons of data in those contexts. That's why context is so important, that the data itself isn't actually all too different. So getting into new markets can actually reuse those contexts or questions to kind of seed new data in new markets and new scripts. So that's been really helpful. But one of the other ways that we're thinking about it is, obviously with more things like GPT-3, we're moving into, few shot or zero shot learning. And that's the whole benefit of it, is even if we were to add a brand new context our product has never seen before, it should leverage all of the training from the, massive data set that it's trained on to have, a guess at what the accurate prediction is, or training it with a few examples or few shot, it should be able to kind of hone in on what that looks like. So we've thought about different ways, again, to actually leverage things like GPT-3 to spit out example data labeled in the way that we expect it, and then just retrain that back into our model.
You mentioned GPT-3 a few times and some of these large general purpose models. I'm wondering, what are some of the other areas of NLP and AI and transfer learning advancements that have been most beneficial to the area of conversational AI and being able to build these types of interactive interfaces?
I might send you back to our AI engineer's most recent article. So I think that the GPT-3 large general products hit the nail on the head. His most recent article talks about training the Allen NLP library on 11 billion parameter model in a single node. So I think that is in part kind of the breakthrough over time that GPT-3 hasn't been able to learn on. And just the breadth of data that we can have and compute, I guess, really has been probably our most beneficial learning, because, in the early days, even our little model had very little data, but our model today has, nowhere near 11 billion parameter model, but it's pretty large. And, the training time that it takes has gone up to retrain our model consistently, but it stayed pretty level in the advancements in how we're able to actually just deal with the training aspect as well.
And in terms of the ongoing research and industry developments that are happening in the space of AI, I'm wondering, what are some of the aspects that you're keeping a close eye on with the hopes of being able to benefit from and apply to the work that you're doing at Structurally?
Yeah, I think obviously I've talked about GPT-3. That's the one that we love to keep an eye on the most. I don't think that we have any plans to ever move our conversational model to that, because again, usually you have to move to a completely generative kind of conversation approach, and then we would have to lose all of our customization at that point, basically. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense for us to ever move there yet. Maybe there'll be some changes that support that a little nicer. But right now, we want to be in control of what the output of the messages is. We just want to be in control from an AI machine learning perspective of what's being predicted to allow that to happen. That's where we're really honing in on. But then I would say GPT-3. I would also say better conversational tools. So there's a really great company called Voxable that just came out with actually a GPT-3 powered conversational design assistant. There's a number of companies out there. VoiceFlow is another that's pretty focused on kind of like conversational design as a whole, because I think that is such a overlooked but important aspect of conversational AI that doesn't get a lot of love because it's so hard. If you want to build an app that can think through every possible turn of a conversation, it's almost really hard to comprehend. And a company like Voxable really understood that and honed in on that and said, hey, we understand that it's hard to kind of think through example conversations to design your conversational AI apps. What if we use tools like GPT-3 to like seed example conversations for you so you can play them out better and tweak them? There's a huge mental burden that kind of comes off of you when you can kind of see examples of that happening, and it kind of gets the wheels turning. So I think that's a huge opportunity kind of in the conversational design space, but powered by AI too.
Another interesting element of what you're doing is the fact that you are a relatively early stage company. You're building your core capability around a machine learning model and an AI process, which I know can be quite time and labor and cost intensive. And I'm wondering what you have seen as some of the sort of challenges of being able to fund the bootstrapping process to be able to get to a point where you're able to actually start the flywheel spinning and maintain momentum, and what you've seen in your experience within the industry of the sort of availability of capital and willingness of investors to be able to give you the sort of the additional runway that's necessary to be able to actually build out those initial capacities to prove out the functionality of the project that you're trying to build out.
So I think the right investors know that AI doesn't just come about. It starts with very specific data and it kind of grows from there. Our investors fully understand that. What we've kind of run into now was, there's always that kind of cold start problem of, well, I don't have much data. I think that you can actually kind of get around that a lot quicker than we did back in the day with things like GPT-3 to really seed your data really quick. When we started, we just said, well, we kind of have to build humans in the loop to start so we can get every aspect, every message tagged. We're not going to take any for granted. And that's what we did. We even seeded some data ourselves internally, pretty rudimentarily, get it started. And then I would say we're kind of at a new point where it's like we really need to see our AI start to perform in these markets or use cases where we have a ton of data and kind of, cut out all of our human in the loop, except for very small use cases. And our investors and even large partners understand that that's happening. And so I think that just from a VC perspective, savvy AI investors know kind of those different waypoints as you grow your company, and they'll kind of expect you to get there. But I will say that, at least for companies that started when we did, there was probably a little slower going because none of these models existed when we started. None of these concepts really even existed, and they were really developed during this time. And I think we have a lot more democratized kind of approach to some basic NLP than we did at the beginning of when we started the company. So I think that even now today, investors might see that as shortening the timeline to get to market. But ultimately, they know that at some point, you're still going to run into this blocker where it's like, you still kind of will always need humans in some regard. There's no such thing as fancy self-learning AI. It always takes some sort of labeling to some degree. And they understand that. And they might just expect you to hit that quicker, but then solve it a little bit more aggressively once you get there.
And another aspect of building a business around AI is sort of the computational expense of training and running the models. And I know that particularly in the deep learning space, a lot of people are starting to lean more heavily on GPU capabilities, but then there have also been efforts underway to apply things like network pruning to be able to reduce the overall weight of the model and allow it to run at speed on CPUs. And I'm wondering what you see as the potential benefits of that area of exploration and research as we do start to move away from the brute force capacity of GPUs to be able to cut down on that overall computational cost.
We've done a little bit of everything here again, too. So we actually started with a in-house GPU rig that we trained all of our models on, sandbox and staging and production models. And that worked well for a time, but then we outgrew it. We moved to cloud GPUs basically at that point. And now we're using the Google Workspace GPUs. And even still, like our relatively large model, but not massive by any means, is taking usually about 4 to 5 days to retrain. And that's cumbersome because, we want to work in our development sprints to see improvements weekly in our models. But when you're trying to retrain models constantly, it takes 4 to 5 days. It just kind of adds up. So we don't have a great answer there yet. We're using the cloud to try and get some leverage on our models in different ways there. But, obviously there's going to be a lot of work that will be done there that can benefit us.
And as you have been building out the Structurally business and working with your customers and working in this space of conversational AI, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen either the Structurally platform or conversational AI generally applied?
My favorite use case is probably through email. So our product supports multiple channels: text, email, live chat. And one of my favorite use cases is just generally different like software companies or other companies reaching out to their previously canceled or churned or lost customers over email and just say, hey, it's been a while since we talked. We have some new features, products, offerings. Wanted to see if you'd come back. And there's actually a lot that goes on behind the scenes to make email work and to actually make it work in a human-like way. So we have to be able to use a custom address. We don't want to use, some random at structurally dot, production, whatever. They want to say, at insurancecompany.com. And that whole process in itself is actually relatively tricky, especially when we have to route their messages, only certain messages from their email to us to get predicted, labeled, and reply on their behalf. So that has been a really fun and tricky, ongoing engineering problem as a whole that I really like, because when you're having a conversation over text or over live chat, you're kind of used to it, like from a chatbot perspective, even though it's still really early. But when you're talking to someone over email, it just feels harder to spoof as a human. You don't really ever get spammy type bots over an email because it's so hard to kind of go through all those different layers, I think. And so I think, we are being very careful in making sure that it comes across human. But I think we succeeded really early on there to make it feel human. And, there's just a lot that goes into that, which has been really fun and unique to see how people are using it.
As you have been building out the business and working in this space, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
I originally thought that building script customization was impossible. I will be the first to admit that I told my team that when we started, that, hey, we'll never be able to customize these conversations like competitors could. Like we had early competitors that were human based. So they just kind of spun up like teams from across the world, kind of gig economy, part-timers, just having conversations manually. And obviously you could build a little UI around that to say, hey, human behind the curtain, say this in this scenario. Pretty easy because a human can kind of determine where that might need to be put into a conversation. But how would you ever do that for AI? How would you ever string together all the different scenarios or turns in a conversation? I didn't think it was possible to start, but our team figured it out and allowed a really complex customization layer on top of the AI to make it happen. So I would say that was my biggest learning. And I'm excited, like I said, to see where conversational design as a whole goes, because I think there's a lot more that could be done there. We built a robust script customization UI, but it's also very complex because of all of the different turns that goes into a conversation. And I'm excited to see what companies come out to make that simple so that anyone, anywhere can really quickly spin up very human-like, complex conversations through conversational AI.
And for people who are looking to be able to automate more of the interactions that take place within their business or within their product, what are some of the cases where conversational AI is the wrong choice and they might be better served with a simple, decision tree based chatbot or actually having a, proper human in the loop?
Yeah, so one area that we've seen not work well for us is when you have a very referral heavy business. So you very rarely would want to ever put another assistant or anything in the way of you and a friend, basically. So if you work in a business that's very kind of sphere of influence heavy or referral based, I would say that you're much better off keeping that to very simple conversations since you already know them. There's no easy conceivable way to ever, put the prior relationship you have with someone into some app that a conversation can like piggyback off of. Maybe someday that could be possible. But right now, it doesn't make a lot of sense for any of our customers to ever have an AI or assistant for that matter kind of interject in those referrals or sphere-based relationships.
As you continue to work on the product and capabilities of Structurally, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term?
Yeah, I think I've talked a lot about making the script customization really streamlined through potentially GPT-3 or other generative AI. The other thing is making our follow-up. So I kind of mentioned the three different types of customization in our product. One is the drip campaigns or the follow-up builder. Right now, that's a very basic product and it's not terribly productized yet. We have yet to see a way to combine all three of those products in a really seamless way. And this is kind of why I was mentioning, like, I'm really excited about like the UI UX aspect of this a lot more than the machine learning, because that's already kind of getting there and ahead of times. I think that the like behind the scenes stuff is way further ahead than the UI side of things. So I'm excited for that to catch up. And we have really big plans to combine the drip follow-up and the script follow-up and the custom answers into kind of one seamless builder to say, design a conversation. And you can say, if a lead doesn't reply for a day, send this message. But then if they do reply with this, reply in this way. But then if they ghost you for 2 days, follow up again. But if they say this and they want to be followed up with in 6 months, actually follow up with this message in 6 months. So it's really about like designing a super intelligent, essentially like salesperson who's very experienced in putting that into a whole product that we're really rallying around.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. This week, I'm going to choose a tool that I've been using for a little while now called Vantage. And it's a better cost management platform for your AWS spend than what AWS offers. So it makes it so you can actually somewhat understand where the different costs are coming from. So I've been able to get a lot more benefit of being able to understand where we can cut out some resources or optimize our spend there. So if you're running an Amazon, definitely worth taking a look at what they're building there. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Nate. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, from a tool perspective, one of the tools that we've been using is Video Form. New to us, pretty competitive to other like video recording sales tools. We've been excited about it because we use it internally, but we're also going to leverage it in our product to allow our customers to send videos and images or GIFs of themselves in the conversation to kind of, again, make our conversations feel even more human-like. So really appreciate what they're doing. Love the approach to kind of cut through the noise in terms of sales messages with personalized video.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Structurally and in the conversational AI space. It's definitely a very interesting problem domain. So it's been fun to learn more about some of the ways that you're tackling it and some of the happenings in the space. So I appreciate all the time and effort you're putting into that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate being on. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.